10 Things You Should Know About the Donner Party. Explore 10 key facts about one of the most gruesome episodes from the era of westward expansion. James F. and Margaret Keyes, Reed, who were members of the Donner Party. Credit, public domain. The Donner Party started its trip dangerously late in the pioneer season. Travel on the California Trail followed a tight schedule. Immigrants needed to head west late enough in the spring for there to be grass available for their pack animals, but also early enough so they could cross the treacherous western mountain passes before winter. The sweet spot for a departure was usually sometime in mid to late April, yet for unknown reasons, the core of what became the Donner Party didn't leave their jumping-off point at Independence, Missouri until May 12. They were the last major pioneer train of 1846. And their late start left them with very little margin for error. "Oh, I am beginning to feel alarmed at the tardiness of our movements," one of the emigrants wrote. "Yeah, and fearful that winter will find us in the snowy mountains of California." They fell behind schedule after taking an untested shortcut. After reaching Wyoming, most California-bound pioneers followed a route that swooped north through Idaho before turning south and moving across Nevada. In 1846, however, a dishonest guidebook author named Lansford Hastings was promoting a straighter and supposedly quicker path that cut through the Wasatch Mountains and across the Salt Lake Desert. There was just one problem: no one had ever traveled this, so Hastings cut off with wagons. Not even Hastings himself, despite the obvious risks and against the warnings of James Clyman, an experienced mountain man. The 20 Donner Party wagons elected to break off from the usual route and gamble on Hastings' back road. The decision proved disastrous. The immigrants were forced to blaze much of the trail themselves by cutting down trees, and they nearly died of thirst during a 5-day crossing of the Salt Desert. Rather than saving them time, Hastings' shortcut ended up adding nearly a month to the Donner Party's journey. The immigrants lost a race against the weather by just a few days. Despite the Hastings cut-off debacle, most of the Donner Party still managed to reach the slopes of the Sierra Nevada by early November 1846. Only a scant 100 miles remained in their trek, but before the pioneers had a chance to drive their wagons through the mountains, an early blizzard blanketed the Sierras in several feet of snow. Mountain passes that were navigable just a day earlier soon transformed into icy roadblocks, forcing the Donner Party to retreat to nearby Truckee Lake and wait out the winter in ramshackle tents and cabins. Much of the group's supplies and livestock had already been lost on the trail, and it wasn't long before the first settlers began to perish from starvation. The majority of the Donner Party immigrants were children. Like most pioneer trains, the Donner Party was largely made up of family wagons packed with young children and adolescents. Of the 81 people who became stranded at Truckee Lake, more than half were younger than 18 years old, and 6 were infants. Children also made up the vast majority of the Donner Party's eventual survivors. One of them, 1-year-old Isabella Breen, would go on to live until 1935. Map showing route of the Donner Party. Credit, Kmusser, Wikimedia Commons. A few pioneers managed to hike to safety. On December 16, 1846, more than a month after they became snowbound, 15 of the strongest members of the Donner Party strapped on makeshift snowshoes and tried to walk out of the mountains to find help. After wandering the frozen landscape for several days, they were left starving and on the verge of collapse. The hikers resigned themselves to cannibalism and considered drawing lots for a human sacrifice or even having 2 of the men square off in a duel. Several members of the party soon died naturally, however, so the survivors roasted and consumed their corpses. The gruesome meat gave them the energy they required, and following a month of walking, 7 of the original 15 made it to a ranch in California and helped organize rescue efforts. Historians would later dub their desperate hike the Forlorn Hope. A Donner Party member murdered 2 people for use as food. During the Forlorn Hope expedition, the hiking party included a pair of Indians named Salvador and Luis, both of whom had joined up with the Donner emigrants shortly before they became snowbound. The natives were the only members of the group who refused to engage in cannibalism, and they later ran off out of fear that they might be murdered once the others ran out of meat. When the duo was found days later, exhausted and lying in the snow, an emigrant named William Foster shot both of them in the head. The Indians were then butchered and eaten by the hikers. It was the only time during the entire winter that people were murdered for use as food. Not all of the emigrants engaged in cannibalism. As their supplies dwindled, the Donner emigrants stranded at Truckee Lake resorted to eating increasingly grotesque meals. They slaughtered their pack animals, cooked their dogs, gnawed on leftover bones and even boiled the animal hide roofs of their cabins into a foul paste. Several people died from malnutrition, but the rest managed to subsist on morsels of boiled leather and tree bark until rescue parties arrived in February and March 1847. Not all of the settlers were strong enough to escape, however, and those left behind were forced to cannibalize the frozen corpses of their comrades while waiting for further help. All told, roughly half of the Donner Party's survivors eventually resorted to eating human flesh. Sierra Nevada mountains. The rescue process took over 2 months. Of the 5 months the Donner Party spent trapped in the mountains, nearly half of it took place after they had already been located by rescuers. The first relief parties reached the settlers in February 1846, but since pack animals were unable to navigate the deep snowdrifts, they only brought whatever food and supplies they could carry. By then, many of the emigrants were too weak to travel, and several died while trying to walk out of the mountains. 4 relief teams and more than 2.5 months were eventually required to shepherd all the Donner Party survivors back to civilization. The last to be rescued was Louis Kesselberg, a Prussian pioneer who was found in April 1847, supposedly half-mad and surrounded by the cannibalized bodies of his former companions. Kesselberg was later accused of having murdered the other immigrants for use as food, but the charges were never proven. One rescuer single-handedly led 9 survivors out of the mountains. Perhaps the most famous of the Donner Party's saviors was John Stark, a burly California settler who took part in the Third Relief Party. In early March 1847, he and 2 other rescuers stumbled upon 11 emigrants, mostly kids, who'd been left in the mountains by an earlier relief group. The 2 other rescuers each grabbed a single child and started hoofing it back down the slope, but Stark was unwilling to leave anyone behind. Instead, he rallied the weary adults, gathered the rest of the children and began guiding the group single-handedly. Most of the kids were too weak to walk, so Stark took to carrying 2 of them at a time for a few yards, then setting them down in the snow and going back for others. He continued the grueling process all the way down the mountain, and eventually led all 9 of his charges to safety. Speaking of the incident years later, one of the survivors credited her rescue to nobody but God and Stark and the Virgin Mary. Only 2 families made it through the ordeal intact. Of the 81 pioneers who began the Donner Party's horrific winter in the Sierra Nevada, only 45 managed to walk out alive. The ordeal proved particularly costly for the group's 15 solo travelers, all but 2 of whom died, but it also took a tragic toll on the families. George and Jacob Donner, both of their wives and 4 of their children all perished. Pioneer William Eddy, meanwhile, lost his wife and his 2 kids. Nearly a dozen families had made up Donner wagon train, but only 2, the Reeds and the Breens, managed to arrive in California without suffering a single death.